The silence was the first thing that hit you in Elena Santos's apartment. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with the ghosts of unsewn stitches and unpaid bills. For a year, the sewing machine, once the thrumming heart of her home and her livelihood, had sat dormant in the corner, shrouded in a thin layer of city dust. Today marked exactly 1 year since the call, the one that had fractured her world with the news of a construction accident, the one that had stolen her husband and left a gaping wound where her future used to be. At 45, Elena felt ancient. Her bones ached with a weariness that sleep couldn't touch, a deep, cellular exhaustion from grieving and fighting a losing battle. The air in the cramped room was stale, carrying the faint, sour smell of worry. From the other room, she could hear the soft, rhythmic creak of the floorboards as her 10-year-old son, Leo, tried to play quietly, as if he knew that any loud noise might shatter the fragile piece she was barely holding together. She felt his quietness, like a physical weight on her chest, a constant, painful reminder of the childhood joy she could no longer provide. On the rickety kitchen table, beside a single wilting flower in a glass jar, lay the eviction notice. The red ink of the final warning seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, a stark pronouncement of their failure. Elena's fingers, raw from cheap detergent and anxiety, traced the harsh legal text: vacate the premises within 24 hours. The words were a death sentence. She opened the small, worn tin box where she kept their remaining funds. She counted the bills and coins for the 10th time, her lips moving silently as if the ritual might magically increase the sum. $187.42. That was it, the sum total of their existence. The mountain of medical debt from her husband's last days had been an avalanche, swallowing their savings, their dignity, and finally, their home. A sharp, acidic pang of hunger twisted in her stomach, a familiar sensation she'd been ignoring for days. Making sure Leo ate what little they had, the shame of it burned behind her eyes, hot and prickly. She felt the hollow space in her gut, not just as hunger, but as a void where hope was supposed to be. It was a physical, gnawing emptiness that mirrored the desolation in her soul. Every cruel detail of her present was tethered to the past. Her husband, Marco, hadn't just died. He'd been erased by a so-called freak accident, a faulty scaffold, they said. A tragic, unavoidable event, but for Elena, it was a brutal theft. The memory of him was a sensory assault. She could almost smell the sawdust and sweat on his work clothes when he'd come home, his laughter echoing off the thin apartment walls. She could almost feel the reassuring weight of his calloused hand covering hers, a silent promise that everything would be all right. Now, that memory was a source of profound pain. His absence was a tangible thing in the room, a chilling draft that no closed window could block. She felt a familiar, sharp ache tighten around her ribs, the phantom limb of a life that had been amputated without warning. The grief was no longer a wave that came and went. It was the ocean she was drowning in, and the surface was getting farther and farther away. She was sinking into a cold, dark place, and she was terrified that this time she wouldn't have the strength to kick her way back up for air, not even for Leo. Leo was the anchor that kept her from being swept away entirely, but watching him was its own unique torture. At 10, he was a ghost of the boisterous boy he used to be. He moved through their decaying apartment with a somber quietness, his shoulders hunched as if carrying his own invisible burdens. He saw the eviction notice. He heard her crying softly in the night when she thought he was asleep. He understood the hunger. Just last night, he had solemnly pushed his half of a shared can of soup towards her, his big dark eyes full of a worry that no child should ever know. "You eat it, Mama. You work harder." The words had shattered what was left of her heart. A fresh wave of nausea rose in her throat. She had failed him. She, his mother, his only protector, had led him to this precipice of absolute ruin. Every forced smile she gave him felt like a betrayal, a brittle mask that she feared would crack and reveal the sheer terror underneath. The fear for his future was a physical pressure, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe, a constant, high-pitched ringing in her ears that drowned out everything but the sound of their impending doom. As the weak afternoon light faded, the city's grey shadows bled into the apartment, painting long, skeletal fingers across the floor. The finality of their situation began to set in with the cold of the evening. Tomorrow, tomorrow, they would be homeless. Her gaze fell upon the silent sewing machine. Its needle pointed accusingly at the ceiling. It was her only skill, her one weapon against the world, and it was utterly useless. A cold dread, heavy and metallic, settled in the pit of her stomach. The distant wail of a siren cut through the evening air, a sound that seemed to be mourning her specifically. She felt her knees buckle, and she sank to the floor, the rough, cold wood a small final insult. The weight of the past year, of the bills, of the grief and the hunger, pressed down on her, crushing the very air from her lungs. This was it, the end of the road. She was a widow, soon to be homeless, with a child who deserved a world she could not give him. There was nothing left. What would you do if you were in her place, facing the street with your child, and less than $200 to your name? If this story already has you hooked, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the shocking twist that comes next. The phone rang. A shrill, jarring sound that sliced through the suffocating silence of the apartment. It was a noise so alien in their quiet world of grief that it made Elena jump, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs with a new, unfamiliar dread. For a moment, she considered not answering. It could only be another creditor, another voice dripping with false sympathy before delivering a final, brutal demand. But something compelled her. Her hand, trembling slightly, picked up the receiver. "Hello," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The voice on the other end was crisp, formal, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Am I speaking with Mrs. Elena Santos?" it asked. It was a lawyer's office. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. What fresh hell was this? Legal action. They were going to be sued for the money they didn't have. She felt the floor tilt beneath her, the last of her strength failing. The man's disembodied voice continued, oblivious to the panic storming inside her. He wasn't calling about debt. He was an executor of an estate belonging to a man named Alistair Finch, the great-uncle of her late husband, Marco. The words were a confusing jumble, a legal language she couldn't pass. Then, two words cut through the fog: inheritance and property. Elena's mind stalled, unable to process the information. Marco had never mentioned a great-uncle, let alone one with property. It had to be a mistake, or worse, a cruel, elaborate scam. Yet, the lawyer droned on with cold, factual certainty. As the sole surviving heir of Marco Santos, the property was now hers. A lake house. The phrase felt like something from a dream, a fairy tale. A house, a roof, a sliver of impossible, dangerous hope began to wedge its way into the solid despair in her chest. A tiny, flickering candle in an endless cavern of darkness. The decision was no decision at all. It was a reflex, a desperate lunge towards the only life raft in a churning sea of ruin. The alternative was the street, a horror she refused to let Leo experience. The lawyer provided an address, a place far from the city, nestled by a lake she'd never heard of. It was their only path. A frantic, nervous energy suddenly coursed through Eleanor's veins, replacing the leaden exhaustion. She knelt before Leo, forcing a brightness into her voice that felt like a lie. "Leo, we're going on an adventure," she said, her voice cracking just a little. "A house by a lake, just for us." His eyes, so long clouded with a child's understanding of adult sorrow, widened with a spark of genuine excitement. That tiny spark was all the fuel she needed. She felt the suffocating weight on her chest ease, just enough to take a full breath. For the first time in a year, a future, however uncertain, seemed possible. The next few hours were a chaotic blur of motion. They packed their meager lives into 2 cardboard boxes and a single, battered suitcase held together with twine. Her sewing machine, the heavy, silent monument to her lost livelihood, had to be left behind. She sold it to a pawn shop for a handful of crumpled bills, the transaction feeling both like a lifeline and a profound betrayal of her past self. The sound of the eviction notice tearing into pieces was a small, satisfying act of rebellion against the fate that had cornered them. Holding Leo's hand, she walked out of the apartment for the last time, not daring to look back. The slam of the door was a definitive, thunderous period on a chapter of their lives defined by loss. The city air, thick with exhaust and failure, felt suffocating. She found herself yearning for the clean, pine-scented air the lawyer had vaguely described. The journey began on a crowded, rumbling bus. The air inside was stale, a mixture of diesel fumes and the lingering scent of too many people in too small a space. Elena clutched the worn envelope containing the lawyer's letter and their dwindling cash, her knuckles white and stiff. She felt every lurch and bump of the ancient vehicle as a jolt to her fragile nerves. Leo, however, was mesmerized. He pressed his face against the grimy window, his breath fogging the glass as the towering grey buildings of the city bled into sprawling suburbs, then finally into the wide, open green of the countryside. Elena watched the landscape change, her heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm against her ribs. Each mile that passed was a mile further from their old life, but it was also a mile deeper into a complete unknown. The monotonous drone of the bus engine was a hypnotic hum of anxiety and hope. As they traveled further, the world outside the window transformed. The wide, smooth highway gave way to narrow, cracked country roads that snaked through dense, intimidating forests. The bars of signal on her old phone disappeared one by one until the screen simply read, "No service." A profound sense of isolation began to creep into the stuffy air of the bus. A silent, unnerving passenger, a chill, unrelated to the temperature, crawled up Elena's spine. The few other people on the bus had disembarked at small, forgotten-looking towns, until it was just her and Leo, alone with the driver. She caught his eye in the large rearview mirror. His gaze was brief but held a flicker of pity, or perhaps just curiosity. A knot of doubt began to tighten in her throat. Where were they going? This wasn't a journey to a new home. It felt like a banishment to the edge of the world. The bus hissed to a stop at a desolate crossroads marked by a single, rust-eaten signpost. The words, "Oak Creek Lake, 5 miles," were barely legible. The bus driver grunted, gesturing with his thumb. "This is it." And then he was gone, leaving them in a cloud of dust and an overwhelming silence. There was no station, no taxi, no sign of civilization. Just the empty dirt road disappearing into the woods and the incessant, high-pitched buzzing of insects. The air smelled thick and organic, a potent mix of pine and damp, decomposing leaves. They would have to walk. 5 miles. Elena's gaze fell on the heavy suitcase, then on Leo's small, tired frame. The fragile hope she had so carefully nurtured over the last few hours felt thin and brittle, ready to snap. The familiar burn of despair began to lick at the edges of her resolve, but she pushed it down, forcing a weak smile for her son. "It's a hike," she said, her voice raspy. "Like camping. We're almost there." After an agonizing hour of dragging the suitcase along the rutted dirt road, they saw it. Through a break in the thick, unkempt trees, a sliver of water appeared, but it wasn't the sparkling blue oasis she had desperately pictured in her mind. The lake was a vast expanse of murky, greenish-brown water, its surface as still and lifeless as glass. And there, on its edge, slumped like a defeated old man, was the house. Elena's heart didn't just sink, it plummeted, a stone dropping into a bottomless well. A cold, heavy dread instantly extinguished the last embers of her hope. The very air here felt wrong, thick and cloying with the smell of stagnant water, and something else, something deeply unsettling. It was the smell of rot, the smell of things long dead and forgotten. This wasn't a new beginning, it was a grave. They drew closer, and the full horror of the place revealed itself. This wasn't a house, it was a skeletal ruin. The wooden walls were a diseased, mottled grey, splintered and warped by decades of neglect. Rough, rotting boards were nailed crookedly over the windows, giving the shack the appearance of a blind, screaming face. A large section of the roof on the far side had collapsed entirely, leaving a gaping wound open to the elements. The small front porch sagged at a dangerous angle, and the door hung from a single, rusted hinge, listing to one side like a broken jaw. Elena felt the last of her strength, the last of her desperate, foolish hope, drain out of her body, leaving a chilling, hollow void. A wave of bitter nausea rose in her throat. She had fled a crumbling apartment, only to arrive at an abandoned tomb. With a deep, trembling breath, she pushed the door. It swung inward with a long, agonizing groan that echoed in the oppressive silence. They were immediately assaulted by the sound of decay. A slow, rhythmic plink, plink, plink of water dripped from the ceiling into a puddle on the floor, a maddening metronome counting down their failure. From within the walls came the faint, dry scuttling of unseen creatures. A low whistle of wind moaned through the countless cracks in the structure. The air was so heavy and damp it felt as though she were breathing water. Elena's breath hitched in her chest, caught in a knot of pure terror. She could hear the frantic pounding of her own heart against the crushing stillness. The isolation was absolute, a physical presence that pressed in on them from all sides. Then the smell hit them, a physical blow that made them recoil. It was a vile, nauseating cocktail of ancient, pervasive mold, the sharp ammonia tang of rodent droppings, and the swampy, fishy odor of the lake itself, all mingling into an unbearable stench of decomposition. The air was clammy and cold, clinging to their skin and clothes like a damp, invisible shroud. Elena reached out a hand to steady herself against a wall, and her fingers sank slightly into a slimy, green film that coated the wood. The floorboards under her feet felt soft and spongy, protesting her weight with soft, wet creaks. A primal revulsion surged through her, a gut-deep instinct screaming at her to turn and run. Her stomach clenched violently. This place wasn't just abandoned, it felt diseased. She turned and saw the look on Leo's face. The adventure had dissolved, replaced by a raw, unfiltered horror that mirrored her own. His lower lip trembled, and his big-armed dark eyes, wide with fear, darted from the cobweb-draped corners to the dark, spreading stain on the floor. He grabbed her hand, his small fingers digging into her palm with surprising strength. "Mama," he whispered, his voice so small and broken, it shattered what was left of her composure. "I don't like it here. It smells bad, and it's scary." The simple, childish truth was a dagger twisted in her heart. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing pressure that made it hard to breathe. She had failed him so completely, dragging him from the precipice of one disaster and throwing him headlong into a fresh new hell. Forcing her legs to move, Elena stepped further into the gloom. The shack consisted of just 2 small rooms. The main living space held a rusted-out wood stove and the remains of a table, one of its legs having rotted through. The second room was a tiny bedroom, where a stained, ripped mattress lay directly on the damp floorboards. Thick, cottony cobwebs hung from the rafters like macabre decorations, swaying gently in the drafts. In the corner of the bedroom, a dark, ominous stain spread across the floor and climbed halfway up the wall, marking the spot directly beneath the hole in the roof. She hesitantly touched the stained wood. It was frigid and slick with moisture. She felt a profound sense of despair, a feeling that the house itself was hostile, actively rejecting their presence with its dampness and decay. She found a back door in the main room, its wood swollen tight in the frame. With a hard shove, it scraped open, revealing the lake. It was just a few feet away. The murky water lapped quietly at a muddy, reed-choked shoreline. Her eyes scanned the perimeter. There were no other houses, no docks, no boats, no sign of life anywhere. Just the dense, dark wall of the forest ringing the opposite shore like a silent, watching army. The lake didn't feel beautiful or peaceful. It felt like a threat, a cold, ancient presence that watched them with a malevolent stillness. The thought of Leo, her precious son, playing anywhere near that opaque, forbidding water sent a jolt of pure, undiluted terror through her body. This place wasn't just a ruin, it was a trap. As dusk began to settle, the shack descended into an almost complete blackness. The boards on the windows blocked the last vestiges of twilight, plunging them into a primal, suffocating dark. The cold intensified, seeping up from the damp floorboards and clinging to their bones. They had no light, no power, no running water, and only a few cans of cold beans from their journey. Elena sank onto the filthy, damp mattress, pulling a trembling Leo into her arms, wrapping him in her thin jacket. The city apartment, with its red-lettered eviction notice and ghosts of a happier life, now seemed like a lost sanctuary. She had thought she had hit rock bottom then, on her knees on the cold apartment floor. She had been so wrong. This was rock bottom, a cold, isolated, rotting hell, miles from help, with her terrified child in her arms. The tears she had held back for so long finally broke free, hot and silent, soaking the collar of her shirt as she held her shivering son in the absolute darkness. The first night in the shack was an ordeal of 1,000 small tortures. A violent thunderstorm had rolled in just after dusk, a furious biblical tempest that seemed intent on tearing the fragile structure from its foundations. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the walls, a high, keening wail that sounded like a tormented spirit. Thunder cracked directly overhead, each deafening blast vibrating through the spongy floorboards and into Elena's bones, making her teeth ache. Rain lashed against the boarded-up windows and poured through the gaping hole in the roof, the sound of its relentless drumming, a counterpoint to the maddening ice rhythmic dripping in the main room. Elena and Leo huddled together on the single damp mattress, shivering under her thin jacket. The air was frigid and thick with the smell of wet rot and ozone. With every flash of lightning that illuminated the room in a stark, ghostly white, Elena felt her heart seize with a primal terror. She was holding her son in a tomb, praying it wouldn't become their coffin before morning. She awoke not to an alarm, but to the cessation of noise. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world washed in a pale, weak grey light that filtered through the gaps in the walls. The oppressive silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the storm's fury. A profound exhaustion weighed on her limbs, a deep ache in her joints from the cold and the tension of the night. Her body felt stiff and old. Beside her, Leo was still asleep, his small face peaceful for the first time in days, his chest rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. For a fleeting moment, a fragile sense of relief washed over Elena. They had survived the night. It was a small, pathetic victory, but it was something. She carefully disentangled herself from Leo's sleeping form, her movements slow and deliberate. Trying not to disturb the first real peace he'd had, she needed to see the damage, to assess the new landscape of their despair in the cold light of day. Her stomach growled, a hollow, painful reminder of their other, more immediate problems. As her bare feet touched the floor, they landed not on the damp, splintered wood she expected, but in something slick and gritty. A gasp escaped her lips. She looked down. There, perfectly defined in the dim light, was a footprint. A patch of dark, wet mud in the shape of a large boot. Her blood ran cold. The print was too large to be hers, far too large to be Leo's. Her mind stuttered, refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. An intruder. The word exploded in her thoughts, instantly vaporizing the fragile relief she'd felt moments before. Her heart, which had been beating with a slow, weary rhythm, suddenly began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her breath caught in her throat, a strangled, silent scream. The isolation of the shack, which had been a source of crushing despair, now transformed into a source of pure, undiluted terror. They were utterly alone, miles from help, and someone had been inside their flimsy shelter. Someone with big, muddy boots, her eyes wide with panic, darted from the first print and found another, and then another. A clear, deliberate trail of wet, muddy footprints leading across the floor of the main room. A cold, paralyzing fear gripped her, rooting her to the spot. Her muscles screamed at her to run, to grab Leo and flee into the woods, but her feet felt as though they were nailed to the floor. The prints were fresh. The mud was still dark and wet, glistening faintly in the weak morning light. They hadn't been here yesterday. They had appeared during the storm. She followed the terrible path with her eyes, her heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. The trail began near the back door, the one that led directly to the muddy shore of the lake. It was a path leading from the dark, silent water and into their home. The image of a figure emerging from the murky depths of the lake and stalking towards the house flashed through her mind, a scene from a horror film that was now her reality. With a trembling hand, she crept towards the back door, the source of the violation. A sliver of desperate, rational thought insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe the door had blown open in the storm, maybe it was a vagrant seeking shelter. But when she reached it, a new wave of chilling confusion washed over her. The door was closed. Not just closed, but swollen tight in its frame and firmly locked from the inside with the heavy iron bolt she had slid into place the night before. She pushed against it. It didn't budge. It was sealed as tight as a drum. Her mind recoiled, unable to reconcile the two facts, the locked door and the muddy footprints. It was impossible. Yet the proof was there, stark and undeniable, on her floor. The fear twisting in her gut sharpened into a terrifying, illogical puzzle. The footprints were real. The locked door was real. How could anyone have gotten in? A cold draft seemed to lick at her ankles, and she felt the tiny hairs on her arms stand on end. Her gaze snapped back to the trail. A terrible realization began to dawn. This wasn't the path of someone seeking random shelter. The footprints didn't meander or explore the small space. They formed a straight, deliberate line from the back door through the center of the main room and headed directly for the one other doorway in the shack. The doorway to the tiny bedroom where she and Leo had been sleeping, vulnerable and oblivious, through the storm. A violent wave of nausea surged up from her stomach, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. The intruder hadn't just been in the house. They had been moving towards them. The image of a dark figure standing in the doorway, watching them sleep, was so vivid, so terrifyingly real, that she could almost feel the malevolent presence in the room with her now. The air grew thick and heavy, and she felt a suffocating pressure in her chest. Every instinct screamed that she and her son had been, and perhaps still were, in mortal danger. She followed the last few prints on her hands and knees, her body trembling uncontrollably. The trail led right up to the threshold of the bedroom, and then, impossibly, it stopped. The prints just vanished. The floor just inside the bedroom doorway was as bare and damp as the rest of the shack, but clear of mud. There was no smear, no scuff, no indication of someone turning around. There were no footprints leading away, no trail returning to the back door or to any other exit. It was as if the person who had made them had reached the doorway and simply dissolved into thin air. She crouched low, her cheek almost touching the cold, grimy floorboards, her fingers hovering over the last perfect, muddy boot print. Her rational mind fought for an explanation, for any explanation, but found none. It was a riddle written in mud and terror, and it made no sense. This illogical, supernatural quality of the event was almost more frightening than the intrusion itself. It was a violation of the laws of reality. Panic began to bubble in her chest, hot and frantic. Her mind, starved and exhausted, raced in circles, desperately trying to clutch at a logical explanation. Was it a cruel prank by some local youths? But who would come out in that storm, to this forgotten place? Was it a ghost? The thought, once laughable, now felt horribly plausible in this decaying, isolated shack by the sinister lake. Local folklore, ghost stories told to frighten children, but the mud was real, cool and gritty under her fingertips. The cold dread seeping into her marrow was real. She felt watched, exposed, as if the very walls of the shack had eyes. The profound isolation that had been a source of despair now felt like a death trap. There was no one to call, nowhere to run. The 5-mile walk back to the deserted crossroads felt like an impossible journey across a hostile planet. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of the wind, now sounded like a footstep, a breath. She was a fly caught in a very old, very patient spider's web. She scrambled back to the mattress and shook Leo awake, her movements jerky with suppressed panic. "Leo, Leo, wake up," she whispered, her voice tight and strained. She tried to keep the terror from her face, to shield him from the fresh horror that had invaded their lives, but she knew he could feel her trembling. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his brow furrowed with concern at her state. "Time, what is it, Mama?" She wanted to grab him and run, to not stop running until the rotten smell of this place was a distant memory. But the rational part of her brain, small and weak as it was, knew it was a foolish impulse. Where would they go? Back to the road, back to homelessness, with even less money than before. To be exposed and vulnerable in the open woods seemed just as dangerous as staying in the shack. A profound feeling of being trapped, of having no good choices, settled over her. She was caught between a terrifying mystery and the certainty of ruin. A new, desperate resolve began to form amidst the fear. Running blindly was not an option. She had to understand what had happened. She had to know what she was up against. This place, this inheritance from a man she never knew, was at the center of it all. It held the key. "Stay here," she told Leo, her voice firmer than she felt. She returned to the spot where the footprints vanished, her terror giving way to a grim, focused determination. Getting down on her hands and knees, she ignored the grime and the dampness, her heart still thudding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was the nexus, the end of the trail, the point of the impossible disappearance. The answer had to be here. She ran her hands over the floorboards, her fingers probing, pressing, searching for anything. A loose nail, a hollow sound, a secret latch. She didn't know what she was looking for, But she poured all of her focus into the task, the outside world fading into a blur of fear and adrenaline. Her fingertips, raw and sensitive, brushed against the edge of one of the floorboards directly under where the mattress had been positioned. It moved, not much, just a fraction of an inch, but it shifted under the pressure of her touch. Unlike the others, it wasn't securely nailed down. A jolt, a potent mixture of terror and a strange, wild hope shot through her. The footprints didn't vanish into thin air. They led to this exact spot. The person hadn't dissolved. They had gone down. Her mind reeled. A trap door, a hidden entrance. The house, which had seemed merely a dilapidated shell, suddenly felt complex, layered, full of secrets. This single loose board changed everything. It was the first tangible piece of a puzzle she was just beginning to comprehend. The muddy footprints were no longer just a terrifying mystery. They were a map, and she was standing at the X that marked the spot. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps as she realized she was on the verge of a discovery. She needed a tool, something to use as a lever. Her eyes scanned the squalid room, landing on a pile of rusted junk near the cold, silent wood stove. Amongst the debris, she saw it, a heavy, rust-pocked tire iron. It felt cold and solid in her trembling hands, a weapon against the secrets of the house. She returned to the loose board and knelt, wedging the flattened end of the iron into the narrow crack. The air was thick with tension. She put her weight into it, and the old, damp wood groaned in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, splintering crack that echoed loudly in the silent shack, the board gave way. She pried it up and pushed it aside, revealing a dark, square hole in the floor. The impossible had just become real. It was a hidden entrance, just as she'd suspected. The mystery of the vanishing footprints was solved, but a dozen new, more frightening questions rushed in to take its place. Who made this door, and why, and what lay waiting in the darkness below? A blast of cold, stale air rushed up from the opening, carrying a strange and unfamiliar smell. It was a subterranean scent, a mixture of damp, rich earth, stone, and the faint, sharp tang of old, oxidized metal. The darkness within the hole was absolute, a perfect, absorbing black that seemed to drink the weak light of the room. It was a void, a wound in the floor of the house leading down into the unknown. It felt like staring into an open grave, a primal fear of the dark, of enclosed spaces, of the unknown things that lurk beneath the surface, made her want to slam the board back into place and pretend she had never found it. But she couldn't. This was the heart of the mystery. The trail had led her here for a reason. Ignoring it was no longer an option. She had to know what was down there. Her own survival and Leo's might depend on it. She felt a chill crawl up her spine that had nothing to do with the cold air rising from the hole. Leo, his initial fear now completely overshadowed by a 10-year-old's boundless curiosity, crawled over from the mattress. His eyes were wide as he peered into the dark opening. "What is it, Mama?" he whispered, his voice hushed with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He leaned closer, his small face framed by the darkness of the hole. For a moment, Elena's heart seized with fear, imagining something reaching up from the blackness to grab him. But his next words cut through her fear. "There's something down there," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "I can see something shiny." His youthful eyes, better adjusted to the dim light, had spotted something she couldn't see. The word shiny hung in the air, a tiny incongruous spark of possibility in the overwhelming gloom and decay of their surroundings. It was the lure, the irresistible glint of treasure at the bottom of a dark and frightening well. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her old, cracked smartphone. The battery was critically low, the red icon flashing a dire warning, but it had just enough power left. She switched on the flashlight, and a thin, weak beam of white light cut through the oppressive darkness of the crawl space. The beam swept across damp earth, thick cobwebs that hung like burial shrouds, and the stone foundations of the house. Then it landed on what Leo had seen. Half buried in the dirt, directly beneath the opening, was a metal object. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a shoebox, but the flashlight beam reflected off its dark, tarnished surface. It was a box, a heavy-looking sealed metal box. It was old, coated in grime and a fine web of rust, but it was unmistakably intact. Her heart began to pound a new rhythm, not of fear, but of frantic, wild anticipation. This was it. This was what the intruder, the ghost, the memory, had been trying to show her. Retrieving it was an ordeal. The crawl space was shallow, but the box was just out of easy reach. Elena had to lie flat on the filthy floor, the dampness and grime soaking into her clothes, and stretch her arm deep into the cold, spiderweb-filled darkness. The earthy smell was overpowering. Her fingers brushed against something cold and solid. She recoiled for a second before forcing herself to grasp it. The metal was frigid, and the box was far heavier than she had anticipated. Her muscles strained as she hooked her fingers under the edge and began to drag it through the dirt towards the opening. With a final desperate grunt of effort, she heaved it up through the hole and onto the floor of the bedroom. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that seemed to shake the whole shack. She and Leo stared at it, their breath held in a shared, silent suspense. The object felt ancient, a relic from a forgotten world, now sitting in the middle of their desperate one. The box was a simple, functional thing, made of dark, heavy-gauge steel. It was sealed not with a padlock, but with a thick, rusted latch that was clamped down tight. There was a sense of urgency, of finality to its design. This was made to protect its contents not from thieves, but from time and the elements. Her fingers, clumsy with adrenaline and cold, fumbled with the stiff mechanism. She pulled and twisted, but it wouldn't budge. The rust held it fast. "Let me try, Mama," Leo whispered, pushing her hands aside. His small, nimble fingers found a better purchase. He threw his whole weight into it, his face contorted with effort. There was a loud, grating shriek of metal on metal, a sound that set Elena's teeth on edge, and then, with a final, echoing clang, the latch sprang open. The sudden noise made them both jump back. The box was open. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of decades. With a deep, trembling breath, Elena reached forward and lifted the heavy lid. A musty, ancient smell wafted out, the scent of old paper and dry, brittle fabric. The inside of the box was lined with a thick layer of oilcloth, which had become yellowed and cracked with age, but had miraculously done its job. The seal had held. The contents, nestled within, were remarkably preserved, shielded from the dampness that had consumed the rest of the house. Elena's eyes widened as she took in the sight. This was not a box of old photographs or forgotten trinkets. This was an archive, a collection of documents, carefully ordered and preserved, waiting for someone to find them. Her hands hovered over the contents, a strange sense of reverence washing over her. She felt like an archaeologist who had just stumbled upon a king's tomb, a sacred space that held the story of a lost life. The air in the room felt different, charged with the energy of the past. On the very top of the pile was a thick sheaf of papers, folded and tied with a faded red ribbon that crumbled to dust at her touch. She carefully unfolded the top document. The paper was heavy and creamy, the kind of paper used for important, official things. The text was written in a flowing, old-fashioned cursive, the ink now a faded sepia tone. Her eyes scanned the legal language, and a jolt went through her. She recognized the property description. It detailed the plot of land, the shack, and the shoreline of Oak Creek Lake. And she recognized the name signed at the bottom in a bold, confident hand, Alistair Finch, her husband Marco's great-uncle. These were land deeds, but they looked different from the copies the lawyer had shown her. These were covered in official-looking stamps and embossed seals. They felt original. They felt real. A question began to form in her mind. If these were the real deeds, what were the ones the lawyer had? Beneath the deeds lay several tightly rolled-up documents, held fast by brittle rubber bands that snapped as she touched them. She carefully unrolled the largest one across the floor. It was an old, hand-drawn geological survey map, dated 1978. The page was a dizzying array of complex topographical lines, depth charts, and cryptic chemical symbols. Her eyes struggled to make sense of it all until she saw the section that was heavily circled in red ink. It corresponded to the area of their land that was submerged beneath the lake. Scrawled in the margins were notes in the same decisive handwriting as the signature on the deeds. Words and phrases leaped out at her, each one hitting her with the force of a physical blow. Significant deposits, high-grade concentration, neodymium, dysprosium, rare earth minerals. A choked sound escaped her throat. This worthless, forgotten patch of land, this swampy, miserable ruin, was sitting on top of a fortune. At the very bottom of the box, nestled in its own indentation in the oilcloth lining, lay the heart of the discovery. It was a small, handsome journal, bound in dark brown leather, its cover swollen and slightly warped from the long years in the damp earth. A thin leather thong was wrapped around it several times, holding it closed like a secret. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with the years and the story it held within. This felt different from the documents. The deeds and surveys were about property and wealth, but this was personal. This was a voice, the voice of Alistair Finch, the man who had led her here, not with a will, but with a trail of ghostly footprints from his own watery grave, a profound sense of connection to this stranger, this forgotten branch of her family, washed over her. He had left this here for a reason. He wanted to be heard. She ran a thumb over the worn leather cover. It was cool and slightly tacky to the touch. The material smelled faintly of old books, damp earth, and something else. Something distinctly human, like the ghost of pipe tobacco smoke trapped in the grain. On the front cover, 2 initials were embossed in what was once gold leaf, now faded and tarnished. A.F. Alistair Finch. She thought of her husband, Marco, who had never known this man, had never known he was the heir to such a secret. Had Marco's accident been as random as they claimed? A cold knot of a new, darker suspicion began to form in her stomach. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered all around her. The run-down shack, the valuable land, the suspicious death of her husband, and this journal felt like the one thing that could connect them all. This wasn't just about a hidden fortune anymore. It was about justice. With a final, decisive movement, she unwrapped the leather thong. The journal fell open in her hands. The pages were yellowed and fragile at the edges, but the paper in the center was still strong. And the ink. The ink was a dark and bold blue, as if it had been written only yesterday. It was a neat, cursive hand, the writing of an educated and deliberate man. The first page was headed with a date, June 12th, 1978. For a moment, she just stared at it, the words blurring through the unshed tears in her eyes. This was a time capsule, a message in a bottle that had finally washed ashore. She was about to hear a voice that had been silenced for over 40 years. A story that had been buried, both literally and figuratively, was about to be unearthed. The weight of the moment was immense. She felt like she was standing on a precipice, about to take a step into the past that would irrevocably change her future. Her eyes fell upon the first few lines of the entry, and the world outside the small, dusty room faded away. The final survey results are in, Alistair had written. The strike is bigger than we ever imagined. Potentially one of the richest deposits in the state. Blackwell is ecstatic, but I see a different glint in his eye now. It is not the glint of discovery, but of pure, unadulterated greed. It is a dangerous, all-consuming greed, and it frightens me. He speaks of our future, but his gaze seems to look right through me, as if I am already an obstacle. I must be careful. The name, Blackwell, sent an electric jolt through her, a shock of recognition and dread. The mystery was no longer an abstract puzzle of footprints and papers. It now had a name, it had a face, it had a motive, and it was a motive as old as humanity itself, greed. The story was beginning, and it was already a dark and terrifying one. Elena slowly closed the journal, her knuckles white as she clutched it to her chest. She looked up from the box, her gaze drawn through the grimy window towards the lake. The still, murky water was no longer just a feature of the landscape. It was a treasure chest, and it was a crime scene. This dilapidated, rotting shack was no longer just a ruin. It was a vault, a witness, a monument to a secret that had refused to stay buried. The fear she had felt earlier, the heart-pounding terror of the intruder, the prince, the unknown, had not vanished, but it had changed. It had crystallized into something harder, colder. It was no longer the fear of a victim. It was the cold, sharp dread of someone who had just been handed a terrible truth, a truth that was both a treasure and a weapon. The footprints hadn't been a threat, they had been a summons, a ghostly hand from the past, pointing the way not just to a fortune but to a fight. The dry, musty smell of the past rose from the journal's pages, a scent of brittle paper, faded ink, and a profound 40-year-old sorrow. Elena's fingers, still smudged with the grime from the crawlspace, trembled as they traced the elegant, deliberate cursive. This was not just a book, it was a testament, a voice from a watery grave. She felt an immense, crushing weight settle upon her shoulders, the weight of a story that had chosen her as its keeper. The weak light filtering into the shack seemed to dim, focusing all its energy on the small, leather-bound object in her lap. The rest of the world, with its hunger and its splintered floorboards, fell away. There was only the silent shack, the sleeping boy, and the ghost who was finally beginning to speak. A cold, heavy dread, thick as the lake's murky water, pooled in the pit of her stomach. She felt a profound and terrifying certainty that once she read these words, her life, already fractured, would be shattered into unrecognizable pieces. She took a ragged breath and began to read. The early entries painted a picture of excitement and discovery, a story of two partners on the brink of a geological lottery. But the name Arthur Blackwell, when it first appeared, was a discordant note in the symphony of hope. It felt cold on the page. Eleanor read a passage from a few weeks after the initial survey, her lips moving silently, mouthing Alistair's words. Arthur is a man of immense charm and ambition, but his hunger is unsettling. When I speak of the beauty of this land, of the quiet dignity of the lake, his eyes are vacant. He sees only the numbers on the survey, the dollar signs buried beneath the mud. He called the lake a puddle covering a gold mine. There is a ruthlessness in him that I mistook for drive. I feel a chill when he claps me on the back, the false warmth of his hand a stark contrast to the cold calculation in his gaze. He is already spending the money in his head, building an empire on land that we are merely guests upon. I fear his greed will poison this place, and perhaps us along with it. Elena felt a shiver trace a path down her spine. The words were a perfect echo of the unease she felt in this place. She flipped forward, her fingers brushing against the fragile, yellowed paper. Her eyes scanned entries detailing Blackwell's growing impatience, his secretive phone calls, his meetings with lawyers to which Alistair was not invited. Then she found the final entry. It was dated October 4th and as 1978. The handwriting was different here, hastier, more jagged, the letters sharp with terror and resignation. It was a farewell, a confession, a verdict. He knows that I know he is trying to cut me out, but it is worse than that. I saw the forged documents he prepared, my signature clumsily mimicked. He means to have it all. He invited me for a final boat ride tonight, to celebrate our success. I see the truth in his dead eyes. He is going to kill me. He will stage it as a drowning, a tragic accident on the lake. If you are reading this, it means my body has been found and my voice has been silenced. Arthur Blackwell murdered me for this land. This box is my only witness. Do not let him win. A strangled sob escaped Eleanor's throat. The journal fell from her numb fingers onto the mattress. The air was stolen from her lungs, replaced by an icy, suffocating certainty. Murder. The word echoed in the silent, rotting shack. Murder. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a fact, written in a dead man's hand. And in that one horrifying moment of clarity, all the disconnected pieces of her own tragedy slammed together with violent force. Blackwell. Blackwell Mining Corp. The name from the journal was suddenly familiar, a ghost from her more recent past. She scrambled for the worn envelope that held the few papers from her husband's death. Her hands shook so violently she could barely pull out the flimsy accident report, and there it was, in cold, bureaucratic print, the name of the subcontractor on the construction site where Marco had fallen, a subsidiary, wholly owned and operated by Blackwell Mining Corp. A wave of vertigo washed over her, so intense she had to grip the edge of the mattress to keep from collapsing. The room tilted, the shadows seeming to writhe and twist. It wasn't an accident. Marco hadn't just died, he had been eliminated, the sole heir to $1 billion secret, silenced just like his great-uncle 40 years before. The grief she had carried for a year was instantly transmuted into something else, something white-hot and terrifying. Rage. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the oppressive stillness, a noise so alien to this desolate place that it felt like an auditory hallucination. It was the low, powerful rumble of a high-performance engine, a deep, throaty purr that spoke of wealth and authority. It was not the rattling groan of an old bus or the sputtering of a fisherman's truck. It was the sound of the city, of power, invading their sanctuary of rot and silence. The sound grew steadily louder. The crunch of expensive tires on the unkempt dirt road, a series of sharp, percussive cracks, panic, cold and absolute, seized Elena. Her heart felt as if it had stopped beating, only to restart with a painful, frantic hammering against her ribs. They were no longer alone. The monster from the journal was not a ghost of the past. He was real, and he was coming. The sound of the engine was the sound of the hunter approaching the trap, and she and Leo were the bait. Our primal animal fear took hold, screaming at her to run, to hide, to simply cease to exist. "Leo, get away from the window," she hissed, her voice a choked whisper. Adrenaline, sharp and metallic, flooded her system, sharpening her senses. The world snapped into a terrifying high-definition focus. The box, the journal, the evidence. She couldn't let him find it. Her movements were a frantic, desperate ballet of terror. She scooped the journal and the loose papers back into the heavy metal box, her fingers fumbling with the latch. The cold, rusted metal bit into her skin. With a grunt of effort, she shoved the box back into the dark, earthy-smelling hole in the floor. Her breath came in ragged, painful gasps. Then came the floorboard. It wouldn't fit. In her panic, she'd put it in backwards. A whimper of pure desperation escaped her lips. The engine sound cut out. He was here. He was outside. With a final desperate shove, the board scraped back into place, the sound of splintering wood loud as a gunshot in the silence. She kicked the filthy mattress over the spot, just as a shadow fell across the boarded-up doorway. A sharp, commanding knock echoed through the shack. 3 quick, hard raps. It wasn't a question. It was a summons. The sound vibrated through the flimsy wooden door, through the floorboards, and into Elena's very bones. She froze, her hand still on the mattress, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. Leo, his eyes wide with a fear that mirrored her own, had crawled into the corner, making himself as small as possible. The silence that followed the knock was somehow louder, more menacing than the sound itself. It was a silence filled with anticipation and a known, named threat. She could feel the presence on the other side of the door, a weight, a pressure, a force of will that seemed to suck the very air from the room. Her mind raced. If she didn't answer, would he break the door down? If she did answer, what then? She was trapped. Every instinct screamed at her to stay silent, to hide, but she knew it was pointless. He knew they were here. He had come for them. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that did nothing to calm her frantic heart, Elena forced her trembling legs to move. She crossed the room, each step an eternity. The floorboards groaned under her feet, announcing her approach. She reached for the rusted iron bolt, her hand slick with a cold sweat. The metal was frigid to the touch. With a final, silent prayer, she slid the bolt back. The sound was a loud, grating shriek, the final defense of their flimsy fortress giving way. She pulled the door inward, and the man from the journal stepped out of the pages of the past and into her horrifying present. He was in his late 70s, tall and lean, with a full head of perfectly coiffed silver hair. He was dressed in an expensive tweed jacket and tailored trousers, looking utterly incongruous against the backdrop of decay. His face was a mask of distinguished charm, but his eyes, a pale, cold blue, were like chips of ice. They held no warmth, only a chilling, predatory intelligence that scanned the squalid interior of the shack, taking in every detail, including Elena's terrified face. "Mrs. Santos, Elena Santos?" he asked, his voice a deep, smooth baritone, the kind of voice that commanded boardrooms and swayed politicians. It was a voice accustomed to absolute obedience, yet it was coated with a thick, syrupy layer of false concern. The expensive scent of his cologne, a sharp, spicy fragrance, washed over her, a chemical invasion that warred with the shack's natural odors of mold and damp earth. "And my name is Arthur Blackwell. I was an old acquaintance of your husband's great-uncle." He extended a hand, his skin unblemished by age or labor, his fingernails perfectly manicured. Elena stared at the offered hand, the hand that had pushed Alistair Finch into the dark water of the lake, the hand that had signed the orders that led to her own husband's death. A wave of nausea, hot and acidic, rose in her throat. She felt a violent, primal revulsion. a physical need to recoil from his presence. Her own hand remained at her side, clenched into a tight, trembling fist. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Blackwell let his hand drop, the charming smile never faltering, though a flicker of something cold and hard passed through his eyes. The mask was perfect, but she could now see the monster beneath it. "My deepest condolences for your recent loss," he continued, the sympathy in his voice so profoundly false it was like a physical blow. "And for Alistair, all those years ago, a great tragedy. He loved this place, spent all his time out here, chasing foolish dreams." He gestured vaguely at the crumbling shack, a look of theatrical pity on his face. "I was in the area and heard through the legal grapevine that you'd inherited the old property. I confess, I was worried. It's no place for a woman and her child. It's a ruin, barely fit for squatters. I felt a certain responsibility. As Alistair's old friend, the lie was so audacious, so utterly shameless, that it took Elena's breath away. She could feel the journal, hidden beneath the floorboards, like a block of ice against her skin. He took a step closer, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft, damp wood of the porch. His gaze swept over the squalor, a calculated expression of distaste on his features. "Look, Mrs. Santos, I'll be direct. This place holds sentimental value for me, but it's a liability for you. It's worthless. The taxes alone will be a burden you cannot afford." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a thick, elegant checkbook and a gold pen that glinted in the dim light. The gesture was dismissive, an emperor tossing a coin to a beggar. "I'm prepared to offer you $5,000. Cashier's check. It's far more than this wreck is worth, but it will be enough to get you and your boy a fresh start, away from all of this." $5,000. The number was a profound insult, a grain of sand offered in exchange for a mountain of gold. He wasn't just trying to buy the land, he was trying to buy her silence, her ignorance, and for a pittance. He was testing her. He was trying to see if she knew. Elena's mind was a maelstrom of terror and white-hot fury. The words from the journal screamed in her head. "Arthur Blackwell murdered me for this land." The image of Marco's broken body, of Leo's haunted eyes, flashed before her. Every cell in her body wanted to scream, to lunge at him, to claw at the smiling, monstrous mask he wore. She wanted to shriek the name Alistair Finch in his face, to hold up the journal and watch his composure crack. But the sight of Leo, huddled in the corner, his small body rigid with fear, was an anchor in the storm of her rage. She couldn't. Not now. Not here. To reveal what she knew would be a death sentence for them both. She had to play the part he had cast for her, the grieving, ignorant, pathetic widow. She forced her face into a blank mask, her eyes downcast, her body trembling just enough to seem broken by circumstance, not by terror. The effort was monumental. It felt like holding back a tidal wave with her bare hands. Her silence seemed to unnerve him more than an outburst would have. The mask of charm finally slipped. The smile vanished, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His cold blue eyes narrowed, the predatory light within them intensifying. He was no longer playing the part of the benevolent benefactor. He was assessing her, re-evaluating the threat she posed. The air in front of the shack grew heavy and cold, the temperature seeming to drop several degrees. "You should consider my offer very carefully, Mrs. Santos," he said, and the smooth, charming tone was gone, replaced by a low, menacing growl that was far more honest. He turned his head slightly, his gaze shifting from her face to the vast, placid surface of the lake beyond the shack. The murky, greenish water was perfectly still, reflecting the grey sky like a dark, unblinking eye. The shift in his focus was deliberate, a director pointing a camera at the weapon that would soon be used. He gestured towards the water with his chin, a small, almost casual movement that was laden with menace. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, a blade of ice sliding into the space between them. "It's a dangerous place," he murmured, his eyes still fixed on the shoreline where Alistair's body had washed ashore. "This lake, in particular, so deep, so dark, it has a history of tragedies." He paused, letting the word hang in the cold, damp air. Then he turned his gaze back to her, and the raw, undisguised threat in his eyes made her blood run cold. "Accidents happen, Mrs. Santos. They happen all the time. Alistair, he wasn't a strong swimmer. It would be a terrible shame if history were to repeat itself. A grieving widow and her young son, all alone out here. It would be so easy to get lost in that water, so terribly easy. The words were a death sentence, elegantly delivered. He knew. He didn't know for sure what she had found, but he knew she was a threat that needed to be neutralized. He held her gaze for one more long, terrifying second before the charming mask slid back into place. He gave a curt, dismissive nod, turned on his heel, and walked back to his gleaming, expensive car without a backward glance. The powerful engine roared to life, the sound a final, brutal assertion of his dominance over the quiet landscape. The car disappeared down the dirt road, leaving a cloud of dust and a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than ever before. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, her body trembling violently, the cold finality of his threat settling deep into her bones like the dampness of the shack itself. The danger was no longer a 40-year-old ghost story. It was a man in a tweed jacket, a man who had killed twice to protect his secret, and had just promised her that she and her son would be next. What would you do in Elena's place? Would you take your son and run, abandoning the fight for justice and the fortune that is rightfully yours? Or would you stay and face the monster, risking not only your own life, but the life of your child? Let us know what you think in the comments below. The silence Blackwell left behind was a living thing, a predator far more terrifying than the storm had been. It coiled in the damp air of the shack, thick with the scent of his cologne and the stench of his unspoken promises. Elena stood rooted to the spot, his final words echoing in her ears, a chilling prophecy of drowning. Accidents happen. The phrase was a key, unlocking a 40-year-old tomb of secrets and a fresh grave meant for her. Her heart, which had hammered so violently, now felt like a dead, heavy stone in her chest. The rage that had been a burning fire was now extinguished by a flood of icy, absolute terror. He knew. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough. The game of cat and mouse was over. She was no longer the cat discovering the mystery. She was the mouse, cornered and staring into the cold, unblinking eyes of the snake. The world had shrunk to this rotting shack and the dark, hungry water that lapped at its edges. Every exit was an illusion. She was utterly trapped. Her gaze fell on Leo, who was still huddled in the corner, his small face pale and his eyes wide with a terror he didn't fully understand, but felt with every fiber of his being. He had seen the man. He had heard the low, menacing tone. He had felt the cold that had entered the shack with Blackwell and lingered long after he was gone. Seeing her son's fear was like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that finally broke her paralysis. This wasn't about a 40-year-old murder anymore. It wasn't about land rights or a hidden fortune. It was about the small, warm hand that was now clutching a tattered blanket in the corner. It was about the soft, rhythmic breathing she listened for every night. Blackwell hadn't just threatened her. He had threatened the only thing in the universe that mattered. The terror did not recede, but it was joined by something else, something fiercer and far more primal, a mother's will to protect her young. The shack was a death trap, and the water was waiting. They had to leave. The thought of flight was immediately followed by the crushing reality of their situation. Where could they go? The 5-mile road back to the bus stop was a death march in the open. Blackwell, or someone working for him, would be watching. Going back to the city was impossible. They had no money, no home, no one. They were ghosts, erased from one life and not yet born into another. She felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled her knees. They were checkmated. Every possible move led to ruin. Then her eyes fell on the spot on the floor where the box was hidden, the journal, the deeds, the proof. She couldn't leave it. It was both the cause of her terror and her only potential weapon. It was a heavy, impossible burden. For a moment, she considered destroying it, burning the journal, sinking the box into the deepest part of the lake, and begging Blackwell for mercy. But she knew, with a chilling certainty, that men like him did not grant mercy. They only erased liabilities. A memory surfaced, a fragment from the lawyer's phone call. The property is isolated. Only a few old-timers left around the lake, mostly reclusive fishermen. It was a grasping at straws, a desperate lunge in the darkness, but it was something, an old-timer, a fisherman, someone who knew this land, who had been here before Blackwell's empire had cast its long shadow, someone who might have known Alistair Finch. It was a foolish, dangerous hope. For all she knew, any remaining residents could be on Blackwell's payroll, informants watching the lake for him. But what other choice did she have? Stay here and wait for the accident, or take one last desperate gamble? She looked at Leo, then at the floorboards. The decision was made. She would not wait to be hunted. She would seek an ally, a ghost from the same past that was trying to drown her. It was a plan born of pure desperation, a single flickering candle held against a hurricane. But it was a plan. With a new, frantic energy, she knelt and pried the loose floorboard up once more. The sound of the splintering wood was a small act of defiance. She reached into the cold darkness, and her fingers brushed against the icy metal of the box. It felt heavier now, weighted with the lives it had cost and the one it might save. She heaved it out, the muscles in her arms and back screaming in protest. She had no bag large enough to conceal it, so she grabbed the dusty, threadbare blanket from the mattress and wrapped it tightly around the box, creating a clumsy, heavy bundle. She clutched it to her chest like a shield. "Leo," she said, her voice a strained whisper, but firm. "We're going for a walk, a long walk. You need to be very quiet and hold my hand and don't let go, no matter what." His small hand found hers, his fingers cold but his grip surprisingly strong. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded, his dark eyes fixed on her face, his trust absolute. It was a trust that both terrified her and gave her strength. They didn't leave through the front door. The image of Blackwell's car disappearing down that road was burned into her mind. Instead, she pushed open the swollen back door that led to the lake. The air that hit them was thick and humid, heavy with the promise of more rain. The sky was a bruised, ominous purple-gray. She scanned the shoreline, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. To the right was the road, to the left, a dense, uninviting stretch of woods that hugged the muddy shoreline. That was their only path. With the heavy, awkward bundle clutched in one arm and Leo's hand gripped tightly in the other, she stepped out of the shack. The wet mud of the shoreline sucked at her worn shoes, making each step a struggle. The oppressive silence of the lake was gone, replaced by the high-pitched buzz of insects and the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her veins. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a mother and child walking into the wilderness. The forest crowded the edge of the lake, ancient trees dripping with moss, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. The path along the shore was narrow and treacherous, a tangle of exposed roots and slippery, moss-covered rocks. Elena's arms ached from the weight of the box, and her breath came in short, sharp gasps. But she didn't slow down. She pushed forward, fueled by a potent cocktail of fear and adrenaline. Leo stumbled beside her, his small legs struggling to keep up, but he didn't complain. He just held on tighter, his face a mask of grim determination. They were a single, desperate entity, bound together by her hand and their shared terror. The air grew colder, and a low rumble of distant thunder echoed across the water, a mournful sound that seemed to be warning them back. But there was no going back. The shack behind them was a tomb, and the man who had built it was a monster. They could only go forward, deeper into the unknown. After what felt like an eternity of struggling through the suffocating woods, she saw it. A thin, almost invisible wisp of white smoke, curling up from behind a thick grove of ancient cypress trees further down the shore. It was the faintest sign of life in this desolate landscape, a fragile signal against the darkening sky. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through her, or was it another trap? Her mind raced. Blackwell could have people everywhere. But the smoke was lazy, peaceful. It wasn't the smoke of industry or power. It was the smoke of a simple hearth, a lonely fire against the encroaching dampness. It was the only sign of another human being she had seen besides Blackwell. It was a choice between the known monster behind her and the unknown entity ahead. She chose the unknown. Gripping Leo's hand, she changed direction, leaving the relative safety of the shoreline and plunging deeper into the tangled woods, moving towards the source of the smoke, towards the final, desperate roll of the dice. The trees thinned as they drew closer, opening into a small, secluded clearing. And there, nestled among the trees as if it had grown from the earth itself, was a small cabin. It was the complete antithesis of her own ruin. It was built of dark, sturdy logs, with a stone chimney that puffed the gentle white smoke and a small porch filled with neatly stacked firewood. A handful of well-tended tomato plants grew in pots, their bright red fruit a startling splash of color against the greens and browns of the forest. This was a place of order, of peace, of a life lived in quiet harmony with the wilderness. On the small porch, a figure sat in a rocking chair, his back to them, his movements slow and methodical as he worked on something in his lap. Elena's heart was in her throat. She had found it, the home of an old-timer. She took a deep, shuddering breath, shifted the heavy weight of the box in her arms, and stepped out from the cover of the trees into the clearing, feeling like a supplicant approaching a forgotten shrine. The figure on the porch stopped his work. The gentle rhythm of the rocking chair ceased. He didn't turn around immediately. He just sat there, perfectly still, as if sensing their presence through the air itself. Then, slowly, he rose from his chair and turned to face them. He was old, ancient even, his body wiry and bent like a weathered piece of driftwood. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, a testament to a long life lived under the sun and sky. He wore a simple flannel shirt and worn denim trousers held up by suspenders, but it was his eyes that held Elena captive. They were a pale, piercing blue, set deep within his weathered face, and they were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. They took in her disheveled appearance, the terrified child clinging to her hand, and the heavy, blanket-wrapped bundle she clutched to her chest. He said nothing, his gaze a silent, potent question. He was the guardian of this place, and they were trespassers in his quiet kingdom. Elena's throat was dry, her carefully rehearsed words dissolving into dust. The man's silence was more intimidating than any shouting could be. I'm sorry to bother you," she began, her voice a weak, trembling whisper that was immediately swallowed by the immense quiet of the woods. "I'm staying in the old Finch place." At the mention of the name Finch, a flicker of something passed through the old man's sharp eyes. It was a subtle shift, a barely perceptible hardening of his jaw, but it was there. He knew the name. He knew the place. He folded his arms across his chest, his posture unwelcoming. "That place ain't fit for nobody," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. "Should have been torn down 40 years ago." His words were dismissive, but his eyes never left the bundle in her arms. He wasn't just looking at it, he was assessing it, weighing it, trying to decipher its meaning. He was a man accustomed to reading signs, and he knew they had brought something more than just their troubles to his door. "He left something behind," Elena said, her desperation finally breaking through her fear. Her voice grew stronger, steadier. "Alistair Finch. He left a message." The old man's face, a mask of stoic indifference, finally cracked. The wariness in his eyes deepened into something else, a complex and painful mixture of recognition, sorrow, and a deep, soul-crushing weariness. He took a hesitant step forward, his gaze fixed on the blanket-wrapped box. He knew, in that single, breathtaking moment, Elena knew that she had found him, the ally, the witness, the keeper of the story. She felt the heavy weight of the box, the weight of the last 40 years, shift ever so slightly. She was no longer carrying it alone. With trembling hands, she unwrapped a corner of the blanket, revealing the dark, rusted steel of the metal box. The old man let out a long, slow breath, a sound filled with decades of unspoken grief. "Alistair's insurance box," he whispered, his voice thick with memory. "I'll be damned." He really did it. He didn't ask to see what was inside. He didn't need to. He gestured with a gnarled hand towards the open door of his cabin. "Get inside," he said, his voice no longer hostile but urgent. "Both of you, before this storm breaks for good." The invitation was an order, and Elena obeyed without hesitation. She herded Leo up the sturdy steps and into the cabin, the old man following close behind, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line as if expecting to see ghosts, or worse. The inside of the cabin was a single, warm, cluttered room. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and old books. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and a battered armchair sat beside a table stacked high with fishing lures and well-worn paperbacks. It was a fortress of solitude, a sanctuary built against the wilderness and the past. He bolted the door behind them, the sound of the heavy wooden bar sliding into place, a reassuringly solid thud. For the first time since arriving at the lake, Eleanor felt a tiny, fragile sliver of safety. The man introduced himself as Samuel. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, Pouring them both a mug of hot and sweet tea that tasted like heaven, he handed Leo a piece of hard candy from a tin on the mantelpiece, a small act of kindness that almost made Elena weep. Then he sat down in his armchair, his pale eyes fixed on the box which she had placed on the rough-hewn wooden table between them. "I was his friend," Samuel said, his voice soft now, filled with a profound sadness. "Alistair's, we were boys together, grew up on this lake. He was the smart one, the one with dreams. I was just the fisherman." He paused, his gaze lost in the flickering flames of the fire. "He was a good man, the best of us, but he was naive. He trusted the wrong person. He saw a partner, a friend. I saw a shark circling in the water." He looked directly at Elena, his eyes full of a 40-year-old regret. "I tried to warn him about Blackwell, but Alistair, he always saw the good in people, even when it wasn't there." Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened the journal and pushed it across the table towards him. "He wrote it all down," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He knew what Blackwell was going to do." Samuel didn't pick up the journal. He just stared at it, his face a mask of grief. "I was on the water that night," he confessed, his voice dropping so low Eleanor had to lean forward to hear him. "Out late, checking my lines. It was a moonless night, dark as pitch. I saw their boat, just a silhouette against the stars. I heard them arguing. Alistair's voice, then Blackwell's, cold and sharp, then a splash, a single, choked-off shout." He squeezed his eyes shut, the memory as vivid and painful as if it were yesterday. "I saw Blackwell's boat speed away, back towards the marina. Alone. I should have gone to the police. I should have told someone. But I was 22 years old, and Arthur Blackwell was already a powerful man. I was scared. So I went home, and I said nothing. I've lived with that cowardice every day for 43 years. The confession hung in the air, thick and heavy as smoke. The weight of his guilt was a palpable thing in the small, warm room. "It's not your fault," Elena said, the words feeling inadequate, flimsy. Samuel shook his head, a single, bitter tear tracing a path through the deep wrinkles on his cheek. "When they found Alistair's body a week later, I knew. When Blackwell showed up with his forged deeds and his lawyers, I knew. When he started buying up all the land, putting everyone out, building his empire on my friend's grave, I knew." He looked up at her, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "And I knew about your husband, too." Elena's heart stopped. "What?" she breathed. "I read the papers," Samuel continued, his voice grim. "Saw the name. Santos. I knew Alistair had a nephew somewhere. When I read that your husband had a freak accident on a Blackwell construction site, I knew it was him, tying up the last loose end. The heir. I tried to find you, but you'd vanished into the city. I thought he'd finally won." The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening force. It was all connected, a direct, unbroken line of greed and murder stretching across 4 decades, from Alistair to Marco, and now to her and Leo. Blackwell wasn't just covering up an old crime. He was finishing a job. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. The fog of confusion and fear had finally burned away, leaving behind a hard, cold, undeniable truth. The man who had smiled at her, who had offered his condolences, was a monster of unimaginable cruelty, a man who had orchestrated the deaths of her family for profit. The rage she had suppressed earlier returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a hot, blinding fury. It was a cold, focused, righteous anger, as sharp and deadly as a shard of ice. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a witness, an avenger, and she had the proof sitting right there on the table. The weight of the world was on her shoulders, but for the first time, she felt strong enough to bear it. As this terrible clarity settled over them, the world outside the cabin unleashed its fury. The threatening storm finally broke. The wind, which had been a low moan, rose to a piercing shriek. Throwing itself against the small cabin in violent gusts, rain began to lash against the windows, not in drops, but in solid sheets, blurring the world into a churning chaos of green and grey. A deafening crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the cabin, and the lights flickered and died, plunging them into the warm, intimate darkness of the firelight. Leo, who had been quietly eating his candy by the hearth, let out a small cry and scrambled into Elena's lap. She held him tight, his small, trembling body a stark reminder of what was at stake. The storm was not just a force of nature. It felt like an omen, a reflection of the violence that was about to be unleashed. The sanctuary was no longer safe. The outside world was coming for them. Samuel rose and went to the window, peering through a small, clear patch in the steamed-up glass. His silhouette was tense against the raging storm outside. "He won't wait for the storm to pass," Samuel said, his voice a low, grim prophecy. "He knows you have the box. He knows you won't sell. He can't afford to let you leave this lake alive. He'll send his men tonight." The certainty in his voice was chilling. This wasn't speculation. It was the wisdom of a man who had watched his enemy for 40 years, who knew his habits, his ruthlessness, his lack of patience. The game had moved to its final, bloody phase. The veiled threats and false pleasantries were over. Now came the violence. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the sturdy wooden bar on the door, and it suddenly seemed as flimsy as a matchstick. The warm, safe cabin felt like a fragile eggshell about to be crushed by a brutal, indifferent force. The firelight danced across their faces, illuminating the fear and the resolve. "We need a plan," Samuel said, turning from the window. His eyes, accustomed to seeing in the dark, were sharp and focused in the firelight. "They'll come for your shack first. They'll expect you to be there, cowering. They'll tear it apart looking for the box. That will buy us time." He pointed a gnarled finger at Elena. "You have to go back. I know it's the last thing you want to do, but you have to. Take Leo. Go back and wait. Don't turn on any lights. Make it look like you're asleep or gone. I will watch from here." He gestured to a powerful, old-fashioned lantern hanging by the door. "When they arrive, I will signal you from my window. 3 flashes. The second you see it, you run. Not to the road. You run into the woods, towards the old logging trail behind your shack. It leads right back here. It's a longer path, but they won't expect it. Can you do that?" It was an insane plan, a desperate flight through a storm-lashed forest in the dead of night. But it was the only plan they had. Elena nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Going back to the shack was the hardest thing Elena had ever done. Every step away from the warmth and relative safety of Samuel's cabin felt like a step towards her own grave. The short journey through the woods was a nightmare of whipping branches, sucking mud, and the terrifying, disorienting darkness. The blanket-wrapped box felt like a lead weight, a tombstone she was being forced to carry. Leo, sensing the shift from safety to extreme danger, was silent, his small hand a lifeline in the churning dark. They reached the shack, a dark, slumped shape against the even darker sky, and slipped back inside. The air was cold, and still held the faint, menacing scent of Blackwell's cologne. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. Elena pulled Leo down onto the damp mattress, clutching him and the box to her chest, her eyes fixed on the boarded-up window. Waiting. The waiting was an agony, a slow-motion torture where every minute stretched into an eternity. Every creak of the house, every roar of the wind sounded like footsteps. The sound, when it came, was unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. It was the heavy, guttural rumble of a powerful truck engine, fighting its way up the muddy road. Headlights cut through the torrential rain, sweeping across the front of the shack and painting long, dancing shadows across the interior walls. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. They were here. The truck door slammed shut, a heavy, metallic sound that was followed a second later by another. 2 of them. A cold, professional dread washed over her. Blackwell hadn't sent thugs. He had sent professionals, men who did this for a living. She risked a peek through a crack in the wallboards. 2 large, broad-shouldered silhouettes, clad in dark rain gear, were moving towards the shack. They moved with a predatory confidence, their shapes monstrous and inhuman in the storm. They weren't coming to talk. They weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to finish a job. She pressed her face against the rough wood, her eyes straining to see across the churning water, praying for the signal. For a heart-stopping moment, there was nothing. Just the 2 dark shapes moving relentlessly towards the front door. Then, through the sheets of rain, she saw it, a faint pale light blinking from the direction of Samuel's cabin. 1, 2, 3. The signal. A surge of pure, undiluted adrenaline shot through her body, a jolt so powerful it felt like an electric shock. The time for waiting was over. The time for running had come. "Now, Leo, now," she whispered, her voice a raw, desperate hiss. She scrambled off the mattress, dragging Leo and the heavy box with her. At that exact moment, A sound like a thunderclap exploded from the front of the shack. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a heavy boot splintering the old rotten wood of the front door. They weren't even trying to be quiet. They were a force of nature, as brutal and direct as the storm itself. Another kick, and the door crashed inwards, slamming against the interior wall with a sound of finality. Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't look back. Clutching the box under one arm and hauling Leo by the other, she bolted for the back door. She threw her shoulder against the swollen wood, and it scraped open with an agonizing groan. The wind and rain hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and blinding her. She plunged out of the shack and into the churning chaos of the night. The ground was a treacherous soup of mud and water. Behind her, she heard a shout from inside the shack, a sound of surprise and anger. They knew she was gone. They knew she had the box. The hunters had been alerted. She stumbled towards the tree line, towards the dark, gaping maw of the forest. The woods, which had seemed so terrifying before, now represented their only hope of survival. The old logging trail Samuel had described was somewhere in that impenetrable wall of darkness. She just had to get there before the men behind her caught up. The race for her life had begun. She plunged into the woods, the branches clawing at her face and clothes like skeletal hands. The darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating blackness broken only by the brief, terrifying flashes of lightning that illuminated a hellish landscape of twisted trees and writhing shadows. The roar of the wind and rain was deafening, a constant, overwhelming assault on her senses that drowned out all other sounds. She couldn't hear if they were behind her, but she could feel them. She could feel their pursuit like a pressure on her back, a cold certainty that death was just a few steps behind. She stumbled, her foot catching on an exposed root, and went down hard, the heavy metal box driving the air from her lungs. Leo cried out in fear. For a split second, despair washed over her. It was hopeless. They would be caught. But then she felt Leo's small hand tugging on her arm, his voice a tiny, desperate plea in the storm. "Get up, Mama. Get up." And she did. She forced herself to her feet, the pain in her knee sharp and searing. And she ran. The forest was a labyrinth, a place of disorientation and terror. Every tree looked the same, every shadow a potential threat. Elena had no idea if she was even going in the right direction. The logging trail Samuel had mentioned was a ghost, a myth. She was just running blindly through the woods, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming, her mind a whirlwind of pure animal panic. Then, a flash of lightning illuminated the path ahead, and she saw it. It wasn't much, just a slight depression in the forest floor, a path wider than a deer trail, almost completely overgrown but still there. The old logging trail. A surge of desperate hope flooded through her. Samuel's plan was real. The path to safety was real. She scrambled onto the trail, the footing slightly more even. And she ran with a renewed desperation. The path was a thin, fragile thread of hope in a world that had completely dissolved into chaos and violence. She didn't know how far it was to Samuel's cabin, but she knew she had to keep running. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. It wasn't just the storm she could hear now. It was the distinct, terrifying sound of heavy bodies crashing through the undergrowth behind them. They were faster than her, stronger. They were closing the distance. A beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees just behind her. They were hunting her with a cold, terrifying efficiency. "There! I see them!" A man's voice bellowed, the sound ripped away by the wind, but the words clear and full of menace. The flashlight beam pinned them, a stark, white circle of judgment in the darkness. They were caught. There was nowhere left to run. Elena's mind went blank with terror. She spun around, instinctively putting her body between the hunters and her son, clutching the heavy metal box to her chest like a shield. It was a futile gesture, a final, desperate act of defiance against the inevitable. The two large figures emerged from the trees, their faces obscured by the rain and darkness, their forms bulky and menacing. They were blocking the path, their mission clear in their relentless advance. Just as the two men closed in, their hands reaching for her, a new sound cut through the roar of the storm. It was a sound so loud and powerful it seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet. A deafening blast that echoed through the forest, momentarily silencing the wind and the rain. It was the unmistakable, terrifyingly loud report of a shotgun blast, A spray of buckshot tore through the leaves and branches just above the heads of the two men, raining down twigs and debris. They froze, their hands dropping, their heads snapping up in shock and confusion. A second blast, this one aimed at the ground just in front of them, sent mud and rock spraying into the air. "That's far enough!" a voice roared, a voice that was old and gravelly but amplified by the storm into the voice of God himself. A beam of light from a powerful lantern cut through the darkness, revealing Samuel standing on a rise just off the trail. A long-barreled shotgun held steady in his arms, its twin barrels still smoking in the rain. The two men were momentarily stunned. They had not expected resistance. They had come for a terrified woman and a child, not an old man with a shotgun and nothing to lose. They exchanged a look, a quick, silent communication in the flashes of lightning. Their mission was the box, but their lives were their own. In the split second of their hesitation, Samuel racked the shotgun, the metallic sh-sh of a new shell sliding into the chamber, a definitive, deadly sound that cut through the storm's fury. It was a sound that promised more violence, a sound that said he was not afraid to die here, and he was more than willing to take them with him. The two men, professionals they may have been, made a quick calculation. The box wasn't worth a gut full of buckshot. One of them gave a short, sharp curse, and then they turned and crashed back into the undergrowth, their retreat as swift and brutal as their advance. The sound of their flight was quickly swallowed by the storm, leaving only the three of them and the heavy, ringing silence. Elena stood trembling, the adrenaline draining out of her so quickly her knees threatened to buckle. The heavy box slipped from her numb fingers and landed with a soft thud in the mud. She stared at Samuel, his face grim and set in the lantern light, the shotgun still held at the ready. He was no longer just an old fisherman. He was a warrior, a guardian who had stood between her and death. He had faced down the monsters, and he had won. He lowered the shotgun, the immediate danger having passed, and hurried towards them. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. Eleanor could only nod, unable to form words. She pulled Leo into a fierce embrace. Burying her face in his wet hair, her body racked with shuddering, silent sobs of terror and relief. They were alive. Against all odds, they had survived. The climax was over, but the fight, she knew, was just beginning. This desperate, violent night was not the end of her story. It was the violent, bloody birth of a new beginning. The oppressive weight of the night began to lift with the first, fragile hints of dawn. Back in the warmth of Samuel's cabin, the fury of the storm had receded into a steady, gentle drumming on the roof. The air, thick with the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee, felt blessedly safe. Leo was asleep in Samuel's armchair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, his face finally peaceful. Elena sat at the rough-hewn table, the metal box in front of her, its cold surface a stark reminder of the night's terror. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its place. But beneath it, a new feeling was taking root, a hard, cold resolve. She watched Samuel methodically cleaning his shotgun, the rhythmic, metallic scrape and click, a strangely comforting sound. It was the sound of a protector. A profound, overwhelming gratitude washed over her, and for the first time, she felt she was not fighting alone. The fear was still there, a low thrum beneath the surface, but it was no longer the master. It was fuel. The battle in the woods was over, but the war was just beginning. With the first rays of sunlight painting the rain-washed world in shades of silver and gold, Samuel made the call. He didn't use a cell phone, but an old, heavy rotary phone that sat on a small table by the wall. The sound of the dial turning was a slow, deliberate clicking, a sound from a different era, calling on a justice that felt just as ancient and fundamental. He spoke in a low, even voice, not to the local police, but to a state prosecutor in the capital, a man he called an old debt. Eleanor listened, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs, as Samuel laid out the entire 40-year history in concise, powerful sentences. He spoke of Alistair, of the murder he witnessed, of the journal, the deeds, and the attack on Elena and her son. There was no hesitation in his voice, only the unburdening of a lifetime of guilt and silence. When he hung up the phone, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer the silence of fear, but of anticipation. He looked at Elena, his pale eyes clear and steady. "They're coming," he said. The real law. The wait was an eternity of minutes. Every sound from outside, the call of a bird, the drip of water from the eaves made Elena jump. Then, a new sound began to grow from a distant hum into a low, steady rumble. It was the sound of multiple vehicles, and it sent a fresh spike of fear through her. But as they emerged onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, she saw they weren't the menacing trucks of the night. They were sleek, dark government sedans, official and imposing. They parked in a neat, professional line, and men in dark suits emerged, their movements calm, efficient, and serious. There was no aggression in their posture, only a quiet authority that was more powerful than any overt threat. A man in his 50s, with sharp eyes and a weary but determined face, led the way to the cabin door. This was the prosecutor. As he stepped inside and his gaze met Elena's, she felt a profound shift inside her. The last vestiges of her feeling like a hysterical, helpless victim fell away. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but belief. She was a witness. Inside the cabin, the heavy metal box was opened on the table, becoming the centerpiece of a makeshift courtroom. The prosecutor and his team handled its contents with a quiet reverence, donning white gloves to examine the fragile 40-year-old documents. Elena, with Samuel by her side, providing a silent, steadying presence, told her story. Her voice, though trembling at first, grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by a righteous anger that had finally found its voice. She recounted everything, from the eviction notice to the ghostly footprints, from the terror of Blackwell's threat to the desperate flight through the storm. Then Samuel spoke. He confessed to the agents the secret he had carried for over 4 decades, his voice thick with the grief of his long-dead friend, his eyewitness account of Alistair's murder, a damning, irrefutable final piece of the puzzle. The agents recorded everything, their faces grim and set. The air in the small cabin was electric with the gravity of the truth, a story of greed and murder finally being brought into the light of day. The arm of justice, once set in motion, moved with astonishing speed and force. While Elena was still giving her statement, a convoy of federal agents descended upon Blackwell's empire. Arthur Blackwell was in his palatial office, a room insulated from the world by mahogany and the smell of expensive leather, when the illusion of his power was irrevocably shattered. The sound of multiple cars crunching on his pristine gravel driveway was the first sign that his carefully constructed world was about to end. The firm, non-negotiable knock on his office door was the second. He opened it to find not a subordinate, but the grim-faced prosecutor flanked by federal agents. The mask of distinguished charm dissolved in an instant, replaced by a flash of disbelief, then rage, and finally, the cold, stark terror of a cornered animal. Elena wasn't there to see it, but she could imagine it with perfect clarity. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs, a sound that was the final, definitive end to a story of murder that began on a dark lake 40 years ago. The news of Arthur Blackwell's arrest sent shockwaves through the financial and social circles he dominated. The headlines were sensational, a feeding frenzy for the media. A billionaire philanthropist charged in decades-old murder. Blackwell mining empire implodes amid fraud and homicide investigation. The story of the stolen land and the rare earth minerals was front-page news, a salacious tale of greed and betrayal. The investigation quickly expanded, and the accidental death of Marco Santos on a Blackwell-owned construction site was reopened, reclassified as a homicide. Subpoenas were issued, accounts were frozen, and the entire corrupt enterprise, built on the bones of good men, began to crumble under the weight of its own sins. From the safety of Samuel's cabin, Elena watched it all unfold on a small television, the events feeling both surreal and profoundly validating. A quiet, cleansing wave of relief washed over her, not of vengeance, but of a deep, abiding sense of rightness. The truth was out. The ghosts could finally rest. The legal proceedings that followed were a formality, armed with the original deeds from Alistair's box, the geological surveys, Samuel's eyewitness testimony, and Blackwell's own crumbling network of corruption. The state moved swiftly. The fraudulent documents Blackwell had used to steal the land were declared null and void. In a quiet courtroom that smelled of old wood and justice, a judge's gavel came down with a solid, definitive crack that echoed Elena's victory. The land, the shack, the lake, and the vast unimaginable fortune in rare earth minerals lying beneath it were legally and unconditionally restored to their rightful heir, Elena Santos. She felt a wave of dizziness as her lawyer explained the numbers, some so vast they were meaningless abstractions, but the heavy official document placed in her hands was real. The cool, thick paper felt like a benediction. It wasn't just money, it was security, it was a future. It was the price of her husband's life, and Alistair's, returned to her not as compensation but as justice. The rotting shack, the monument to her despair, was the first thing to go. Elena stood with Leo and Samuel and watched as a bulldozer reduced the symbol of her terror to a pile of splintered, decaying wood in less than an hour. In its place, a new house began to rise. The sounds that now filled the air by the lake were not of decay and fear, but of creation and hope. The clean, sharp whine of saws cutting fresh lumber, the rhythmic report of nail guns, the cheerful shouts of the construction crew. The air smelled not of mold and stagnant water, but of pine, fresh soil, and possibility. The new house was beautiful, with large windows that looked out onto the water. The lake itself seemed transformed, no longer a murky, menacing grave. It was a sparkling expanse of blue, its surface dancing with sunlight. Standing on the wide, sturdy porch of her new home, Eleanor felt the last of the shack's cold dampness finally leave her bones, replaced by the warmth of the sun on her face. The hollow ache of hunger and the sharp sting of shame became distant, faded memories. The silent sewing machine, once a symbol of her failure, was replaced by a new one, a state-of-the-art machine whose happy, productive hum filled a bright, sun-drenched room in her new home. She sewed now not for desperate, meager scraps of money, but for the pure joy of creation, the fabrics rich and colorful under her hands. The scent of a rich stew, thick with meat and vegetables, now filled the kitchen, a constant, reassuring promise that there would always be enough. The greatest transformation, however, was in Leo. The haunted, somber little boy was gone, replaced by a vibrant, laughing 10-year-old whose shouts of joy echoed through the house and across the lake. Hearing that sound, a sound she feared she had lost forever, was a greater treasure than all the minerals buried beneath the earth. A profound, soul-deep peace settled over Elena, a quiet joy that felt as solid and real as the house she now stood in. Years of fear and grief had been washed away, leaving a quiet strength Elena never knew she possessed. One evening, she stood with Leo and Samuel on their new long dock, watching the sun set over the lake. The water, which once promised to be her grave, now reflected a sky painted in breathtaking hues of orange, pink, and gold. A gentle breeze, smelling of pine and clean water, rustled the leaves in the trees. She felt the reassuring warmth of Leo's hand in hers and saw the deep, peaceful contentment in Samuel's weathered face. The memories of Marco and Alistair were no longer wounds, but cherished parts of a story that had, against all odds, found its rightful ending. This was not just a new beginning, it was a redemption, paid for in courage and forged in fire. Her fight was over. If Elena's journey from the depths of despair to the heights of justice moved and inspired you, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss another story of the human spirit's incredible power to overcome the darkness.